Hello, my name's James Harding. I'm the editor of Tortoise, and so, as you might be able to tell from the name, I really appreciate patience. And I just wanted to say a heartfelt apology for having kept you all waiting for quite so long. Just to let you know, because I imagine you're thinking, what's going on? When Greta and Vanessa arrived, I think they've been on the go all day since incredibly early and just needed a breather, not least something to eat. And so when we got them something to eat, I actually asked one of the people that Greta works with, is this lunch at 4 o'clock? And they said, no, it's breakfast. So the reason for the delay is that Greta and Vanessa have literally just sat down to have something to eat. They're going to be with us, we hope, after they've had a moment. But we thought rather than just keep you waiting, we'd get started. I had a brilliant plan, which we would hear from Vanessa, we'd hear from Greta, and if you like, hear the critique of the news, and then get into hearing from Rebecca and Steve. But like all best plans, we're going to do it back to front. So if you might, we're going to hear a little bit from Rebecca Bloomstein and from Steve Sedgwick. But we're also joined, which I think is a thing in itself, by Michael Mann. And so I'm going to start, if I might, this session by inviting Michael Mann to join us. You can see, I hope, the names of everyone who's joining us. Michael Mann, in some ways, has genuinely been there before all of us. Hello, Michael.
Hello, good to be with you.
This is going to be, forgive me again, musical chairs, because I'm going to just sit here so I can see you properly. The aim of this session is for us to talk about a very specific issue as relates to climate, which is the way in which the media covers it. The title of the session, as you'll have seen, is News Travels Fast. And one of the fundamental questions that I think all of us in the media think about, but all of us who are concerned about climate, whether in the political realm or business or activism, think about how do you tell a story that frankly has never been told before at a scale and with a complexity that's never been told before. And if there's someone who's thought more about this for longer than probably anyone else in the room, it's you, Michael, because, you know, for those people who followed this, Michael, you were one of the authors of the IPCC report back in 2001. So you were one of the people who informed, in fact, An Inconvenient Truth as a movie. Tell us what your view is, and, you know, no holds barred. What's your critique of the way in which we in journalism cover the business of science and climate?
Yeah, well, thanks. It's great to be with you all virtually. I wish I was there with you in Glasgow. It's a very exciting time when it comes to our prospects for finally addressing the climate crisis in the way that is necessary. So yeah, I've been in this now for a couple decades, a little more than that. Back in the late 1990s, my co-authors and I published the now well-known hockey stick curve, and it became sort of an icon in the climate change debate. And I found myself in a position that's very uncomfortable for somebody who's trained as a scientist. I found myself sort of pushed into the public sphere when contrarians in the climate change debate, fossil fuel interests, the front groups that do their bidding, politicians who do the bidding of the fossil fuel industry, all sort of set their sights on me and the hockey stick and attempted to discredit this now iconic graphic, in part by discrediting me personally. As I said, it's an uncomfortable place to find yourself as a scientist, but ultimately I've come to embrace the opportunity that provided me to be part of what is arguably the most important conversation we've ever had, the conversation about how we are going to address this existential crisis, the climate crisis. And so I've gotten to know quite a few journalists over the years, quite a few who are my friends. And like, any community, there's the good and there's the bad. And there's so many great journalists on the climate beat, and I consider myself fortunate to be able to interact with them on an almost daily basis. But there have been some real obstacles, false balance, the idea that any proposition needs to be treated as if there are two equal sides. We've finally, I think, come to realize that doesn't serve the public discourse, and certainly not on issues like climate change, where it's quite clear there is only one side, the side of the science that tells us that we do have a crisis. There's a reasonable debate. There is a worthy debate to be had about what we do about this crisis, and I hope that's the sort of discussion that we'll have a chance to entertain here today. But I think the real challenge now is for journalists to not fall victim to some of the tactics that we are seeing deployed by the forces of inaction. Now that denial isn't possible, the inactivists, fossil fuel interests, again, those doing their bidding, front groups, conservative politicians, they can't deny that climate change is happening anymore because we can all see it with our own two eyes. And so instead they've turned to these other tactics in an effort to prevent us from taking the action necessary. I call this the new climate war in my recent book. And it consists of division, dividing us so we're fighting with each other and not holding, acting, speaking with a united voice demanding change, deflecting attention away from the needed systemic changes and policies to individual behavior as if it's all just a matter of you and me changing our diet. That's very convenient for polluters who want to make it about individuals rather than policies that will ultimately hurt their profits. And it goes on. These are the tactics, and delay in particular, and we've seen a lot of that, talking about 2050, talking about net zero carbon emissions decades from now, when we need to be talking about policies that will reduce carbon emissions now. So I would ask my friends in the journalistic community to not fall victim to these insidious tactics that are now being deployed by the forces of inaction. Now that we've gotten beyond denial, delay, as I recently wrote in an LA Times editorial, is the new denial.
Michael, I want to hear from Rebecca Bloomstein, who is the Deputy Managing Editor of the New York Times, and Steve Sedgwick, who's a co-anchor on CNBC. But before I come to both of them, I just wanted to pick up on where you started with this, because I'm really struck by the fact that your experience in the late 90s was so personal. In many ways, the critique in the 20 years since then has really been about a failure of journalism to deal with the timescale of science, the complexity of science, and, if you like, to get science to fit to some of the political to and fro that is the day-to-day of journalism. The point you make about inactivism and inactivists is the next generation of that. And I wondered whether or not there is a way that journalism doesn't make the mistakes that you ascribe to it in the last 20 years, but does acknowledge that there is still complexity, there is still the difficulty of reporting science, and there is still difference of opinion, if not on the science, on what to do about it.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think that there's been a sea change here. I think that the journalistic community and the scientific community have come a long way in how we frame the impacts of climate change. All too often, even 5 or 6 years ago, you would have some unprecedented extreme weather event where climate change clearly played a role. It exacerbated that event, and scientists who were too fearful that they'd be attacked and criticized and mocked would just simply say, well, we can never, blame any one event on climate change. This sort of dismissive opening line that tells your audience, okay, there's nothing to see here. And I think the scientific community has become more savvy, and I think journalists as well have become more savvy in how we go about connecting climate change to these extreme, disastrous weather events that are playing out in real time. Unfortunately, we've been given an assist by Mother Nature in the form of these events that are so unprecedented. A heat wave in Canada that rivals mid-July temperatures in Phoenix, Arizona. These unprecedented floods that we've experienced in my home state of Pennsylvania. So in a sense, nature has provided us some tools here to talk about this as a real-time problem, a problem that is unfolding in real time and hurting people now. And the science has provided something here as well, the so-called detection and attribution sort of mechanisms that are now used by scientists to say, yeah, we can more or less say that this event wouldn't have happened without the exacerbating effects of climate change. So we've come a long way there. I think there's still a little bit of ways to go. There still is a tendency to sometimes avoid making those connections, connecting those dots, when the public needs us to be connecting those dots.
Michael, thank you. I told you about the musical chairs. I'm just going to move back here. This is going to be a particularly odd moment, and Rebecca and Steve will be in on it, in that I've worked in a fair few newsrooms, in the Financial Times, at the Times, at the BBC. But Rebecca and Steve, I'm going to channel, as I suppose in many ways all of us here are, our inner Greta, and put to you, I hope as kind of directly as I can the critique of media, which is A, we were too late to it. B, when we got to it, we ran it on the inside pages and low down the running order. We found it hard to get to the reality of the science. And even now, when we think we're on it, it's still occasional given the scale of the problem. And Rebecca, you know, from your point of view, how do you take what is, I think, often quite a widely held critique of what we in the media do?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me here. I think it's, you know, it is just so important, the issue of climate. It's absolutely core to our report. It's core to so much of what we're doing. And I have to say, as news organizations, Michael just talked about connecting the dots between these recent events. We have no hesitation about that. We at the Times have had a dedicated team since 2017, almost 5 years now. We have more than a dozen reporters. We have experts in drone technology, visuals, data visualization, and we are really committed to scientific evidence and to putting the facts forth that chronicle and document climate change all over the world, including the global north. There's increasingly talk about the global south. I think that it's also fair to say, though, that we are not activists, we are journalists, and the way that we hold the powerful to account is through our coverage, and we are holding companies, we are holding policymakers, we are holding people to account, and increasingly what you were seeing at the Times and I think many other papers is that, and news organizations, is that it is the center of the report. Climate for us has been a huge investment and a huge topic of our most ambitious visual and investigative journalism for some time. And I kind of reject a little bit the notion that it doesn't get much audience or it's been low on the page. We have been pushing it, we have been promoting it, and we are really seeing readers respond.
Steve, what do you think? I mean, I'll put the same argument to you that, you know, we were too late and it ran too low.
I think that's fair enough. I think you have to take that on the chin as a journalist as well. I've been in financial markets and journalism for 33 years, and it's only the last 15 years that I've been concentrating on this. I originally, back in the late 80s, early 90s, I was a trader. I traded oil product, and then when I went to CNBC at the start of the century, was covering a multiple of issues, I became an OPEC reporter. I covered oil and gas and didn't even think about climate at the time. So yes, it's an absolutely honest assessment that I and mainstream journalism and institutions such as CNBC were late and were slow. I just want to respond to what Michael said as well, though, and I can expand a little bit more on the journey we're all on as well, though. But I think Michael is absolutely right. Of course, we know now that this concept of false balance is just so wrong. You cannot equate one side of the argument with the other in this. It is obvious this is the greatest crisis that mankind has faced, is facing, will face going forward as well. But you've got to remember, if you are trained as a proper journalist, if you are trained to be a professional cynic, you are trained also to add balance to an argument. It's not because we're trying to discredit science, a lot of us. There were those forces out there. There were those insidious forces out there. And there still are, according to Michael, the polluters and those who are trying to force inaction and divide those of us who thoroughly believe that this is the greatest crisis facing the planet and humanity as well. But I think you've got to remember, there was a time when it was two bunches of scientists, two bunches of interest groups. Perhaps we got there slow, but for a lot of us who came to this, we were looking at this, we were looking at the science, and we were being told two very different things. There is no equality now. There hasn't been any equality or balance for a very long time. But we had to find that out. That's our job as journalists.
But can I make a point? And I should just say to everyone, look, I really appreciate that people have come hoping to hear from Greta, hear from Vanessa. I hope they'll be sympathetic too. I can't begin to imagine what it's like having kind of the world, literally the world following you day in, day out, and particularly here. So I hope you'll be sympathetic and give us a little bit of time for them to come and join us. I suppose though, Rebecca, I'd put to you, and I'd take Michael's point, you know, I haven't heard the phrase inactivist. Brilliant phrase, by the way. Phrase. It's a really great word. I think you're going to find, Michael, that it's widely used. The one thing about journalists you can be sure of is when a word lands, it lands. But I suppose a deeper criticism is, okay, allow for what Steve says. Allow for the fact that journalism is itself a process of reporting and a process of understanding. There's a deeper criticism that our judgment was wrong. right? That it took us too long to get there, and that even now, we're not reporting what Michael's describing. That when big organizations, governments, companies make grand announcements, because of the nature of the news cycle, because of the speed of news, we report it straight. That information lands, if you like, in the public bloodstream, and more likely than not, it's more talk than walk. And how do you respond to that as a criticism, not of journalism in the last 20 years, but today?
I mean, look, I think that it is our job as journalists to follow up on these pledges and to talk about whether they are being followed or not. And business is, I've been a business journalist much of my life. It is really hard sometimes to get inside companies. It's hard to know whether people are greenwashing, whether they're actually following through with commitments. It is increasingly our job. I totally take it that it's been a bit of a journey, but I can just tell you that it's not only our climate team, it's not only climate journalists, but all journalists are, I think, increasingly realizing that this is a central part of our role here. So I mean, there is not really a false equivalency here. We are past that now. I just heard from Al Gore in the hallway, and he was saying, look, how are we going to know if Glasgow was a success? We're going to have to sit and follow up. There's been some really interesting announcements, some major announcements, but are people following up on their pledges? And that just has to be a core part of what we do as journalists. We also have to go witness things firsthand.
Yeah.
And I was speaking to Hannah Fairfield, our climate editor, and we have been unable largely to do that because of the pandemic. We are beginning to do more of that. We invest time on the ground. We have reporters in 160 countries around the world. And we have to keep doing that, and we have to keep also holding the powerful to account and having those conversations. There's some people who say you shouldn't even have a conversation with a fossil fuel executive. Mm-hmm. And we think that our job is to have those conversations and to hold the powerful to account.
Yeah, I want to pick up on both those points. I too was listening to Al Gore upstairs, and he said something which I thought was spot on. He's probably said it a lot of times before, but it's the first time I've heard him say it. And Michael knows this as well. It takes a very long time for things to happen very, very quickly. And I was at COP21, I was at the Bourget, and quite frankly, it was a lot of words. It was a lot of, as Greta has said, a lot of blah, blah, blah. I genuinely am holding everyone to account that I can. And I've had 40 interviews already this week, from policymakers, from business executives. I've been speaking to a lot of people, and I genuinely believe that long time that we've been talking about since we've been covering COPs at CNBC Europe. 2009, we were in Copenhagen, the COP15, COP21 in Le Bourget. I was there for 2 weeks as well with the team as well. I genuinely believe, and am I a patsy for the business community, for what the politicians are saying? No, I'm a professional cynic. I hold them to account. But when I hear about the kind of money, the kind of commitments I'm hearing, can I give you a very good example? And I'm sorry to drone on and be all business-like, but I spoke to MSCI today, which is MSCI, so the great index provider. And it's been a journey for them. And should I have given up on them in the late 90s when it was part of Morgan Stanley, when they didn't have any clients asking for any climate commitments or any climate measurements tools? Should we have stopped engagement with them? Perhaps no. But in the last 10 years, they have come on leaps and bounds. They now offer climate measurement tools on the CO2 emissions of over 9,000 listed companies, because we've been pressurizing as the fourth estate. We've been working with them as partners as well, and we've been saying, why aren't you doing this? Why aren't you doing this? And the next thing they're doing is looking at the private sector, which isn't the public listed companies, and over 15,000 companies. So that's 24,000 of the biggest companies on the planet have now got their feet to the fire because of engagement with the business community.
Steve, thank you. Michael, can I put to you that, and it was a point actually I'd want to put to anyone who was on the sort of activist side of things, if you like, that we're having the wrong and outdated argument about information. In that these days, if you looked at the organizations that Rebecca and Steve work for, actually they're the people that you want reporting the climate crisis, in as much as there's fact-checking, there's data journalism, there are visualizations. If you look at the experience of the last 18 months, our worry as regards COVID reporting is an infodemic on social media. And we are having an argument that, if you like, is out of date. It's an argument that's 10 years old. And really what we're trying to work out is, how do you ensure more fact-based, better informed, and more engagement with media online. And as a scientist, I'd really be interested to know how you fix that problem.
Yeah, I feel like, we climate scientists decades ago sort of saw this localized cancer that was the bad faith discourse over climate change and the way that disinformation was weaponized by the forces of inaction, the fossil fuel interests, those doing their bidding. And now that local cancer that we had witnessed, we have been horrified to see it metastasize to infect our entire body politic. And that's what's happened now. A total loss of good faith discourse. I think several of us, those of us from the United States remember growing up with the evening news. There were 3 evening news programs. And everybody got the same facts. When Walter Cronkite said that's the way it was on November 3rd, 2021, we all accepted that that's the way it was, that those were the facts, and we could disagree about what the implications of those facts were. So we've now arrived at this point where, again, the forces of inaction have found a way to weaponize misinformation and disinformation and exploit social media in a way that Mark Twain could never have imagined when he famously said that it takes a lie travels around halfway around the world in the time that it takes the truth to get its shoes on, and that's become even more so now with social media. And so, yeah, what we've seen play out with the pandemic, where an issue that ultimately should be informed by scientific assessments of risk has collided with an ideological agenda. In the case of COVID-19, it was former President Trump's political agenda and his need to dismiss the massive threat that this represented. And so that led to a dismissal of all of the public health advice that we were getting about social distancing and mask wearing and vaccine taking. I wish I knew the solution to this larger problem, but that is the problem ultimately that we have to solve. How we deal with this weaponization of misinformation and disinformation in the information age, in the social media age, when there are powerful vested interests and bad state actors that are colluding to poison our public discourse when it comes to matters that might interfere with their ideological agenda.
And
I
Michael,
wish I knew the solution to that.
Well, let me do a very unfair thing to you, Rebecca, which is say this is not your fault, but it is your problem, in that people will look to the New York Times to try and say, okay, how do you correct misinformation that's out there? And you just have to hold your hands up and say, look, we can't do that.
I don't exactly agree with that. I think it is our responsibility to correct misinformation that's out there. And what we're finding is we have a big audience. We announced today we have 8.1 million subscribers around the world. We feel that people are coming to us for climate coverage, for facts. We passed 1 million subscribers outside the US today. What happens when we publish something, we published 4,000 stories on climate change last year, is that we are able to beat out the misinformation online. It's almost like the Google search result. And the New York Times, because of the authority of our brand, is able to beat that back. We employed this during the election in 2020. We also are doing it with coronavirus, and we are doing it all the time with climate change. And I think it is our responsibility to meet people on the social media platforms where they are, to not assume that people are going to come to us, that we have to get the word out. We base our coverage on facts, on science, on firsthand observation and analysis, and also the data visualization that really brings this to life to people. And we have got to make it it's our responsibility really to use technology and social media to get out there and literally bat back the misinformation.
I want to make sure 2 things. One is that although this is by far and away the most beautiful room that I've ever had the chance to have a conversation like this in before, I also realize people think, oh, hang on a second, there's some people who I'd really like to be hearing from and they're not here yet. So if some people wanted to sort of quietly sneak out because that's the truth, we're not going to be offended. So please do feel that way. Equally, we also know there are a lot of a lot of activists, a lot of people who have worked passionately on this subject and who also have views about news travels fast, about how you do make climate the ultimate headline. So if you would like to catch my eye, it's not a subtle exercise catching my eye in this room because it's quite large. So please do give a big wave and I'll make sure we bring the mic to you. There's a gentleman, I think, in green, so we'll make sure we bring a mic. While the mic is coming to you, sir, I'm just going to put a point to Steve, which is there is an argument too around journalism, which is that when we talk about the media, we really talk about ourselves, by which I mean developed economy media, right? Or quote unquote Western media. And you know, one of the conversations that I wanted to have with Vanessa when she got here was to say, look, there is a real question about the extent to which we are talking about many different medias, and also that the priorities of media in some country are understandably and rightly not necessarily having climate change at the top of the running order.
Look, if anyone thinks over the last 5 years the media hasn't looked at itself under the assault it's been under from the previous administration, the MSM, the mainstream media, we have all looked at ourselves and asked the truth. Is that the truth? Are we all biased? Are we all centre, left of centre? Are we actually implicitly biased? And I think we've all had to ask that question. So yeah, it's continually asked and it's a healthy conversation. That's what good journalists, good editors, good producers, they do. They continually ask themselves. And look,
but Steve, sorry, I guess I'm making a slightly different point, which is there's a risk now that
we're in this
room and we're so keen to make sure that we're on this story that actually if you are looking at countries where there are human rights democracy issues, where there are real world poverty issues, and you're sort of unsympathetic to the fact that those run higher in the news than the climate crisis.
But what can we do about journalists in authoritarian regimes? There is very little that you at Tortoise, that you at the New York Times, that I at CNBC can do to encourage their voice, other than report it from a completely unbiased point of view. From a newsroom that's, I'll tell you two things about the CNBC newsroom. One, in 20 years, and I've just done 20 years, I have never ever been told by an editor or producer, you cannot ask that, you mustn't ask that is not the angle to get. The other thing is, and again, I'm not touting CNBC, there's plenty of mixed bag of reporters and what have you in there, is that we have healthy conversations in the newsroom. And I think it's important. And there was a thought a couple of years ago with the onset of social media, which is, I guess, what you're talking about, the evolution and different types of media. We've got to be a lot more careful with what people say in the newsroom and how they express opinions, because this can get out. This could be a video shot from someone's iPhone. This could be a comment that's made as well. And I fought very strenuously against that. I said, no, how do we encourage journalists to be journalists if they can't, in the safe room of the newsroom, express opinions? If they can't express opinions which are perhaps testing everybody's long-held views as well. And the other thing is,
Steve,
just very briefly, let me just say this. CNBC is not monolithic. We are not all good. We are not all bad. We are not all in favour of more action and more activism. We are not all pro-oil companies. I know full well, when I look at some of our coverage, I'm going to say it, I will cringe at some of the things that I hear on the channel, whether that's from fellow contributors or whether that is from guests as well. But then it's my job to go back in and challenge that. It is not monolithic. There is not one set of forces that we're all obeying one set of rules.
So I'm just going to bring the gentleman in green, and there is someone waving at the back. Sir.
Yes, hello, I'm Ingo from Berlin and Boston. I'm with a Zero Emission think tank. Actually, thanks for this great show. It's been a fantastic day. And I think media has done a fantastic job in reporting on the climate crisis. That's been really great. But I'm wondering, on the other side of the medal, on the flip side of the coin, how much does it cost to act on climate and go to the solutions? So the interesting thing here is that Bloomberg, BNF, basically has shown the inflection point in 2017, whereby renewable energy, wind and solar, is cheaper than even going with existing running coal plants. That's true for Germany, India, China, the US, and everywhere. This inflection point has completely been ignored by the media. And you know, renewable energy at half the price, that is so nice what we have. I've talked with 30 delegations here at COP yesterday. I've shown them the data. I've explained to them the flip side of the coin. Nobody was aware of these data. They were all extremely interested. Why is the media failing to talk about the solution, which is so easy. Renewable energy at half the price.
Thank you. Sorry, I didn't hear your name, sir.
Oh, Ingo.
Ingo.
Ingo, yeah.
Rebecca, do you want to respond?
I think it's a very good question, and honestly, I think it's a stretch to say that the media has not covered renewable energy. I think as Steve has said, it's a journey. We cover it quite a bit. We have reporters dedicated to it. I think that the progress of renewable energy, the progress of electric cars, the progress of the companies that are behind them is increasingly becoming front and center both for investors and for our report. But I think that you raise a good point that there's always more that we can do. Media there's this whole question of solutions-based journalism, and when you walked in here today, there was a New York Times print section focusing on solutions. We're really trying to actually not only cover the problems, which media tends to do, but also look at solutions and to provide those for our readers. I think the pace of change here on the renewable front is so great. The pace of the discussion in Europe is admittedly ahead of the US. And I think that it's going to take a little while to catch up, but boy, we are writing about it quite a bit.
That's true.
Can I come back on that point?
Just
on that point.
Well, I'm just aware of time because I want to make sure that I just
All
hear
right.
from. Sorry, Steve, forgive me. There's a lady, or there's someone right at the back, and then someone at the front, and then I'm going to come back for everyone to make their final thoughts.
Hi.
Hello. Are you?
Hi.
Will you wave? Great.
Hi.
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 It's a little dark back
My
there.
name's Grace. I'm from Australia. I run an organisation called Walk Free. And my question today for the media is, you know, Vanessa Nakate, who's hopefully about to join this stage, she's an incredible intersectional climate activist. She really represents a global movement. And as many of us know in this room, she was cropped out of that picture at Davos, which, you know, set this path around cropping out actually the continent of Africa. But once again this week, she's been cropped out of images. So her book, A Bigger Picture, has been released today. It's such an important and powerful story, but yet the same problem has happened again. Why is that happening, and how do we fix it?
And so I didn't hear your name right at the beginning.
Grace.
Grace. One thing I should say, Grace, is that, you know, I think a lot of people know the story. It was a picture, I think you're right, at Davos. It was on the AP. The one thing I feel bad is we don't have someone from the AP who can exactly explain that. But the point about the bigger picture, the story of the South not being told, even though the people of the global South are most affected by climate change, which I hope, Grace, is a reasonable way of taking that conversation forward.
No,
I wonder what you make
absolutely,
of that, Rebecca.
and I so wish Vanessa were here to make this point. I would like to thank her. She has been part of a group of young people who have helped us at the Times, you know, really advised us on how to develop and design this experience that you're having now with all the different panels and making sure all sorts of different perspectives are included. The Global South is really, we can't cover it enough. They are the people who are getting impacted the most. And what's happened recently, and let's be frank, is that there have been the floods in Germany, there have been the fires in the global north, in California, and there's a sense and a frustration among many activists that, well, now people are just starting to pay attention. And this has been happening in the global south for a long time. Her perspective is absolutely important. We are spending a lot of time. Samini Sengupta is our reporter who's focused on the impact of climate change globally. She travels the world to document it, and we are continuing to be very committed to that coverage. And Vanessa, I think her book is a very important one, a very timely one. The fact that she was, I'm really glad that she spoke up after that happened to her, because we need to be very conscious of including as many perspectives as we can. And one last note, I thought it was very interesting, the Prime Minister of Barbados spoke this week. And this is kind of a growing tension almost between the global north and the global south. And she made a very interesting point in a story that Samini made, that in her view, she was actually optimistic that the global north is paying more attention to climate change now that these incidents happened. She felt, and she made the point, that ordinary people pressuring their politicians is really the thing that's going to lead to change fastest here.
I'm going to come to you in 1 second. I just wanted to say, I looked at my phone, just hoping I'll get a message through. I think that Greta and Vanessa are just going to take a break. I hope you really understand. They've been in the eye frankly, of the media spotlight every minute of the day for the last few days. But I just want to say that we're all really sorry because we know people came here and we're really keen to hear from her. The reality is, and one of the good things about COP being a fair few days, is this is not going to be the last moment to hear from her. So everyone who's registered will try and make an effort to get in touch with you and be sure that people can hear on the next occasion when Vanessa is speaking, when Greta is speaking, and make sure that you get the chance to hear their point of views and interact with them. With that in mind, I'm just going to try and bring this to a close. I know that you, ma'am, had a point that you wanted to make. I know there's some people who want to go and hear from the Mayor of Sierra Leone. I'm going to come to you right at the front, the lady here in green, and then Steve, invite you and Michael to make final comments.
Hi, my name's Helen. I'm a co-founder of Women in Climate Tech. I'm old enough to remember the dot-com boom, even though you'd be shocked to think that, but I am.
Some of us were there, Helen. Yeah.
Yeah. All the money flowing to certain types of founders of a certain color and a certain gender, and I see that happening again. Climate tech is exploding, but a tiny fraction of funding and support going for founders, and we're trying to do our best to correct that, but we're all volunteer organizations scrapping about as best we can. I think one of our goals is to try to get women and minorities quoted more and try to get their stories told, but there's no money. There's no money going behind supporting that. Yeah. And being from a public relations standpoint, I think the public relations industry needs to step up and do more volunteering as well.
Helen, let me ask, Helen, thank you very much.
Yeah.
Can I just ask Steve?
I'll come on that. Look, one of the greatest catalysts in my transformation as a human being and as a journalist, and it has been a transformation. I'm a very different person, I'd like to think, than I am working for a different organisation I did many years ago, is that I have two daughters, and I don't want them to go through the 90s and noughties that I went through with the same kind of misrepresentation, whether it be on a gender, whether it be on where you come from, whatever it may well be. And it's a really important point, and it's really crazy for me to do this, but I'm going to tie in with Engel's point as well, is the fact that there are many other absolutely key issues out there. I know that the climate crisis is the issue. I would never deny that. I'm fully paid up. I believe it is the greatest crisis we're ever going to face. But there are stunning numbers of other issues that the media is tackling, whether it be Black Lives Matter, that our company has put billions into trying to make sure that we're not part of the problem as well. There are other crises out there which, let's face it, are more mundane, that are part of my day job, including debt crises, pension crises, COVID crises and the ramifications as well. So there are a lot of things out there, and whether it's gender, whether it's Black Lives Matter, whether it's the energy crisis in Germany and not proper representation there. My point here is we have to cover all this stuff. We cannot be climate crisis headline journalists every single day. That's just not how we're going to bring people with us. I would like to do that. It will just turn people off, and that's the really harsh truth as well. Yes, this is ongoing. Yes, it's the biggest issue, but there's a hell of a lot of other issues out there, including gender, including energy in Germany, that we just have to bring along.
Thank you. Rebecca, and then I'm going to come to Michael.
I would just like to add, I think that that's a really important point that you raise. I was an editor during the telecom boom and bust, and it is distressing to see the same, it's distressing even in mainline tech to see the slow progress of women entrepreneurs, not to mention climate tech. I think it's a really good flag. We certainly are endeavoring to include as many voices as possible, and we're going to just continue to do so. And I think it's definitely worth, in climate tech specifically, to make sure that voices around the world, a diverse group of voices, are heard. So I appreciate you raising that.
Rebecca, thank you. Michael, I wanted to ask you one thing, which is about what your advice to us is on storytelling. Because I remember when I went to Washington as a reporter, my first or second weekend there, I picked up the Washington Post on a Sunday, and I found a section that I loved. And by the time I got to the end of reading it, I realized it was actually the Washington Post kids section, Fun Post. And when I looked at the books that you've written dire predictions, as you mentioned, the hockey stick and the climate wars, the madhouse effect, how climate change denial is threatening our planet, and the book most recently this year, The New Climate Wars. But the book that I went to look up, which I really loved, was The Tantrum That Saved the World, a children's book. And it struck me that there is something here in how we tell stories differently, not in a patronizing way, but in an appealing and warmer way. And I wonder how you think about that, and if there's a lesson for us in journalism in that.
Well, thanks. It was a delightful project to be involved with. I teamed up with Megan Herbert, who is a children's book writer, children's author and illustrator. And we actually put it out on a limited basis a few years ago. It was self-published by Megan originally. Now we have Random House, Penguin Random House is going to be publishing the book in February. And so it'll be available on a much expanded basis, major distributor. And I feel like the book is so prescient. It was prescient. We actually wrote it before Greta Thunberg arrived on the scene.
I know.
Let me bring a few threads here together, because it's really about empowerment of a young girl. Not a middle-aged white man, but the empowerment of a young girl. And I have a daughter who's 15 and a half years old, and that's very meaningful to me. And it begins with a tantrum, because these animals are showing up. They've been displaced by climate change. They're showing up at her door. Initially, she gets very upset, but she channels that anger and that frustration positively. And literally becomes the change that she wishes to see in the world. And it truly was life-imitating art to watch Greta emerge on the scene and almost be the reification of that character that we imagined in the book. And so it's so important for us to have positive narratives. Yes, there is great urgency, and if we fail to act on the climate crisis, then we will inherit a dystopian future. A lot of bad things will happen, and things will get much worse. We're already seeing disastrous climate change impacts. They'll get far worse if we fail to act. So yes, there is great urgency, but there is also agency. There is still time to act to prevent the worst impacts from unfolding. And I believe we need to provide visions not just of the dystopian future that we will inherit if we fail to act, but the sort of future that we can still preserve for our children and grandchildren, where we find a way to live sustainably on this planet and meet the needs of a world population, and there's equity and there's justice, and our planet flourishes. That is still a possible future. And it is so important for us to recognize that this is our moment. Because if we don't act now, we will foreclose on that potential future for our children and grandchildren.
Michael, thank you. That's, I think, a note for all of us, media or otherwise, urgency and a sense of our own agency. Thank you. There's a guy you may have heard of at the New York Times called Tom Friedman, who's written a book called Thank You for Being Late. Personally, I love it, but thank you for your patience. I'm sure that on behalf of Vanessa and Greta, they're also saying, thank you for allowing us not just to be late, but just to have a break. I'm sure you understand their need for exactly that. And also, I just wanted to say thank you to Rebecca and Steve and Michael. As you can imagine, it wasn't exactly the conversation I'm sure you were expecting, but it certainly wasn't the one they were expecting either. And I'd just like to say thank you for quite so gamely stepping in and making sure we had the conversation nonetheless.